I found out my parents had been stealing my identity for 14 years, and the night I finally caught them, they had no idea I already knew. Welcome back to the family revenge tales. I sat at my mother's dining table that night, smiling and passing the mashed potatoes, while inside my own chest, I was counting down the minutes until everything she'd built out of lies came apart. She called it a family legacy dinner. Candles down the center of the table, framed photographs propped against the centerpiece, a speech about sacrifice and loyalty that had my aunt reaching for tissues before the salad course was even cleared. I clapped along with everyone else. I complimented the pot roast, and the entire time, I knew something none of them did, that 2 detectives were already sitting inside my condo, waiting. My name is Savannah Brooks. I'm 34, and for 11 years I've worked as an ER charge nurse at Williamson Medical Center in Franklin, Tennessee. I work nights so I can be home when my son Ethan gets off the school bus every afternoon. I've missed birthdays and holidays because someone has to be there when a person comes through those doors scared and bleeding, and for a long time, being that person felt like the one part of my life I could fully control. Everything else, my marriage, my family, the ground I thought I was standing on, turned out to be a lot less solid than I believed. I got divorced when Ethan was 3. I won't dwell on it. Some marriages just aren't built to survive who you become. What matters is that I raised my son alone after that. I worked doubles, drove a car with 200,000 miles on it, packed lunches at midnight after 12-hour shifts, and saved every spare dollar for 6 years until I finally closed on a condo at Willow Creek Residences. 2 bedrooms, a small balcony, a kitchen window that caught the morning light just right. It was mine. I had never owned anything before that felt so completely, entirely mine. And some nights I would just stand in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, looking around at walls I had actually paid for, and feel something close to peace. Even after the divorce, I kept driving out to my parents' house every Tuesday night for dinner. I'd been raised to believe family stays together no matter what, and I believed it the way you believe things nobody ever taught you to question, quietly, completely, without ever once testing whether it was true. My mother, Patricia, always had something simmering on the stove, usually something that filled the whole house with the smell of my childhood. My father, Ronald, always asked about Ethan's report cards and remembered the names of his teachers better than I expected him to. My younger brother Tyler, 29, still lived in his old bedroom down the hall, drifting between construction jobs that never quite became a career, always a few months behind on something. I loved all of them. I need you to understand that clearly, because this isn't a story about people who were easy to stop loving. It's a story about people who used that love like a tool, quietly, patiently, for years, while I had absolutely no idea. It started with something small. Interest rates had dropped that spring, and I wanted to refinance my mortgage to shave a couple $100s off my monthly payment, money I could put toward Ethan's college fund instead of just letting it disappear into interest. I sat down with a loan officer named Diane on an ordinary Thursday afternoon between shifts, expecting a short, boring conversation about paperwork and closing costs. Diane's expression changed as she scrolled through her screen. She got very still, the way people do right before they have to tell you something they don't want to say. "Savannah," she said slowly, "I'm showing a credit score of 541. I laughed. Actually laughed. Certain it had to be some kind of clerical mistake. My score had been solidly above 700 for years. I'd worked hard for that number, treated it like a small trophy I'd earned through nothing but discipline. She pulled the record again. Same number. She turned her monitor toward me so I could see for myself. "There are several accounts here I don't think you know about." A store credit card I'd never opened, dating back 9 years, a $12,000 personal loan I had never applied for, never signed for, never once heard of, collections accounts with balances I couldn't explain no matter how hard I tried to remember, and every single one of them, when I asked her to check the mailing address on file, led back to the same place. It was my parents' address. I didn't say a word to my mother the following Tuesday. I sat at her table, ate her chicken and dumplings, complimented the cornbread, and smiled while my mind cycled endlessly through every innocent explanation I could invent. Identity theft happens to strangers, I told myself. Someone could have stolen my information from a hospital, a pharmacy, an old job application. It didn't have to mean what it looked like it meant. I believed it, or made myself believe it, for almost 2 weeks, because believing it was so much easier than the alternative sitting right there in front of me. Then I started pulling records. I requested full reports from all 3 credit bureaus. I froze every account still under my control. At night, after Ethan was asleep and the condo had gone quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, I spread everything across my dining table, the way I'd build a patient's chart in the ER, symptom by symptom, date by date, refusing to let myself draw a conclusion until the evidence forced one on me. It took 3 weeks of doing this most nights before the pattern became impossible to ignore. It went back 14 years. 14 years of accounts opened in my name, starting the year I turned 20, right around the time I'd first moved out. Every one tied to my parents' mailbox. My neighbor, a retired U.S. Marshal named Hal Whitaker, found me on my balcony one night, surrounded by paper, a cold cup of coffee forgotten beside me, and he sat down across from me, without asking permission, the way older men who've seen a lot of things sometimes do. "You look like you're building a case," he said. "I think I might be," I told him, and my voice came out smaller than I intended. He looked over a few pages, quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands careful with the papers, like he understood exactly what they might mean before I'd said another word. Then he said something I've held on to ever since. "Paper tells the truth, Savannah. People tell stories. Trust the paper." I started trusting the paper, and the paper told me things I never wanted to know. The account that broke something loose in me wasn't the credit cards and it wasn't the collections. It was a home equity line of credit authorization I found buried in county property records, dated to a Tuesday in October 9 years earlier. My signature sat right there at the bottom, familiar and steady, exactly the way I signed my name. Except that Tuesday, I wasn't signing anything at all. I was in a hospital bed at Williamson Medical Center, 20 hours postpartum, holding my newborn son against my chest, too exhausted to hold a spoon, let alone a pen. I remembered that day the way you remembered the most important hours of your life. The fluorescent lights, the sound of Ethan's first cries, my mother sitting in the chair beside my bed, telling me to rest, that she'd handle everything. Someone had forged my signature while I was recovering from childbirth, on the very day I became a mother. That single document had quietly opened the door to years of exploitation, using my name, and eventually my home, as leverage against everything I was working to build for my son. I sat with that discovery for a long time before I did anything else. I remember sitting on my kitchen floor at 2 a.m, back against the cabinets, just breathing, trying to make the facts fit into a shape that didn't feel like betrayal. They wouldn't fit any other way. Eventually, I called Detective Olivia Bennett in the Financial Crimes Division. She was direct in a way I appreciated. No false comfort, no softening of the truth to spare my feelings. She reviewed everything I'd gathered over 2 long meetings, asking careful questions, cross-referencing dates, and told me plainly that this wasn't a case of a family member panicking and making one bad decision under pressure. This was a system managed carefully, refined over more than a decade. A few days later, she called again, her voice noticeably tighter than before. "There's something else. There's an active application in your name for an $85,000 home equity line of credit. Your condo is listed as collateral. It's scheduled to close in 3 weeks." 3 weeks. Someone was trying to borrow against my own home in my own name without my knowledge or consent and close the deal before I could ever find out and stop it. I asked her what we should do. She said the smartest move was to let the process appear to continue normally on the surface, while they quietly froze the actual transaction behind the scenes. If whoever was behind this believed the plan was still working, they'd eventually grow confident enough to show their hand completely, and we'd have everything we needed. I went back to my parents' house one more Sunday, telling myself I was only dropping off some of Ethan's old baby clothes for a cousin who just had a daughter. While my mother was upstairs on a phone call, I found myself standing in the basement in front of an old metal filing cabinet that had always been locked, one I had never once seen opened in my entire life, not even as a curious child. This time, the key sat right on top of it, small and unguarded, as if the universe had simply grown tired of waiting for me to notice. Inside were folders going back years, organized with a kind of care that turned my stomach. Bank statements that had never once come to my mailbox, sheets of tracing paper with my signature practiced over and over, some clumsy and uneven, others frighteningly precise, clearly the product of real effort over real time. And beneath it all, paperwork belonging to my grandmother Evelyn, who had passed 3 years earlier. Records suggesting a portion of her retirement savings had quietly been redirected in the years before she died. My hands were shaking as I photographed every page, careful to keep my breathing even in case anyone came downstairs. I placed everything back exactly where I'd found it, closed the cabinet, and locked it again, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could be heard through the floor above me. That same week, my father caught me alone in the kitchen for just a moment while my mother was outside on the phone with someone from her book club. He looked at me strangely, like he wanted to say something, his fingers tapping absently against the counter in a rhythm that told me he was more nervous than he wanted to appear. "You've been quiet lately," he said. I told him I was just tired from work, which wasn't entirely a lie. He nodded slowly, like he didn't quite believe me, and for one brief second, something crossed his face that looked almost like shame. A flicker, gone as quickly as it appeared. Then my mother walked back in, cheerful and unaware, and whatever it was disappeared behind his usual easy smile. I didn't confront anyone yet. Instead, I protected what I could, methodically, the way I'd been trained to handle any crisis: assess, stabilize, act. I moved every real document I owned, my deed, Ethan's birth certificate, my own identification, my grandmother's old letters, into a bank safe deposit box, leaving only worthless copies behind at home. I changed every lock in my condo and installed cameras at the front door and the parking garage entrance. And when I checked, out of a fear I could barely put into words, I discovered someone had recently attempted to use Ethan's social security number to open a custodial investment account in his name. My 8-year-old son, who still slept with a nightlight and believed monsters lived under his bed, had already become a target in a scheme he would never even know existed. That was the moment this stopped being about money for me entirely. That was the moment it became about protecting him from people who had already spent 14 years deciding my trust wasn't worth respecting. The legacy dinner arrived 2 weeks before that HELOC was set to close, and by then I understood exactly what was coming. My mother had outdone herself. Candles down the center of the table, old photographs framed and propped between the serving dishes, a speech about family loyalty and sacrifice that had my aunt in tears before dessert was even mentioned. I sat through all of it and smiled, genuinely, because I had made my peace with what was about to happen, and I was ready for it in a way I hadn't expected to feel. Halfway through dinner, my mother leaned toward my father and whispered 5 words I heard clearly over the clatter of silverware and my cousin's laughter down the table. "Have Tyler go now, before dessert." My father nodded once, barely a movement, and reached for his water glass like nothing at all had happened. Tyler wiped his mouth with his napkin, said he needed some air, and slipped out toward the back door with his truck keys already in hand. Nobody at that table noticed. Nobody. Except me. Not long after, my mother clapped her hands together and announced, with real warmth in her voice, that we should all step into the backyard for one last family photo before dessert, something to remember the evening by. Everyone filed outside, laughing, arranging themselves in front of the fading evening light. Tyler was already gone by then, believing he was headed to an empty condo, likely with instructions I still don't fully know the details of. He had no idea Detective Bennett's team was already inside, waiting quietly, exactly where I'd told them to be. It took less than 20 minutes. The back door burst open while we were still adjusting for the photo, my aunt still fussing with someone's collar. Tyler stumbled into the yard, pale as I had ever seen him, his hands trembling so badly he could barely get the words out. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking in a way I had never once heard from him before, not even as a kid. "They were already there. Detectives. They knew everything. I swear I didn't know it would go this far. I swear I didn't." The yard went completely silent, except for the sound of someone's phone buzzing, ignored, in a pocket. My mother's composed smile finally slipped just enough that I saw something underneath it I had never once been allowed to see in 34 years. Real fear. I set my glass down on the patio table, my hands steady in a way that surprised even me, and told them everything. The 14 years of accounts, the forged signature from the day Ethan was born, the $85,000 loan against my own home, the attempt on my son's identity, my grandmother's stolen retirement money. I said it all calmly, evenly, because I had promised myself weeks earlier that I would not scream, would not cry, would not give them one more piece of my emotion to manage the way they had always managed everything else. My father was the one who finally broke. He lowered himself into a patio chair, his knees seeming to give out beneath him, and put his face in his hands. "It started small," he said, barely above a whisper, the same voice I remembered from bedtime stories decades earlier. "Just to cover bills, one time. It was supposed to be one time." My mother said nothing at all. She simply stood there in her own backyard, surrounded by candlelight and photographs of a family that had never truly existed, the way she'd always described it to everyone who would listen. And for the first time in my life, I watched her understand completely, and all at once, that she had lost control of something she'd spent 14 years believing she owned. The weeks that followed moved quickly once the truth was finally in the open air where it couldn't be managed anymore. Detectives executed a search warrant on my parents' house and seized the filing cabinet, the forged signature templates, and years of hidden financial records that told the full story better than any of us could. Charges followed: identity theft, forgery, financial exploitation, attempted mortgage fraud, and elder financial abuse tied to what had happened to my grandmother's savings in her final years. The $85,000 loan was permanently canceled before it ever touched my home. My credit began the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding itself, account by account, month by month, the way anything worth trusting again usually has to be rebuilt, patiently and without shortcuts. Tyler cooperated fully once it was over, answering every question, handing over every message he still had. I believe him when he says he didn't understand how deep it went until that night in the backyard, watching his own hands shake in front of the whole family. My parents did not have that excuse, and on some level we both knew it, even if neither of us said it out loud. Months later, my life looks quieter than it used to, and quieter has turned out to mean safer, which is a trade I would make again without hesitation. I don't attend forced family dinners anymore, and I've stopped feeling guilty about that absence. I open my own mail. I check my own accounts every single month without fail, a habit that has become as automatic as checking a patient's vitals. Hal still sits with me on the balcony some evenings, usually saying very little, which somehow always says enough anyway. My Aunt Linda, who never once doubted me through any of it, calls every Sunday just to check in, and those calls have become one of the steadiest parts of my week. Ethan is 8 now, and he doesn't know most of what happened, only that we changed the locks and that Mommy keeps the important papers in a special box. For now, that's enough for him to know. Someday, maybe, I'll tell him the rest, when he's old enough to understand that love and safety aren't always the same thing, and that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you the most are the ones you have to protect yourself from. For 14 years, my family treated my name like it belonged to them. The night I finally stopped asking for their approval was the night I became the only owner of my own future. If Savannah's story moved you, I'd love for you to subscribe to the Family Revenge Tales. Every story we tell here belongs to someone who found the courage to stop staying quiet. And if you're carrying something heavy tonight, I hope this reminds you that the truth, no matter how long it's buried, always finds its way to the surface eventually. Trust doesn't rebuild itself, and sometimes protecting the people you love means protecting yourself first. There's no shame in that. Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like quietly gathering paperwork at your kitchen table, night after night, until the truth can no longer be denied by anyone, including yourself. What makes this story meaningful, beyond its drama, is the lesson sitting underneath it. Financial abuse within families is real, and it's often invisible precisely because it hides behind the people we trust most and never think to question. Savannah's experience is a reminder to monitor your own credit and financial accounts regularly, no matter how much you trust the people around you, and to understand that love and loyalty should never require silence in the face of exploitation. It also shows that setting boundaries with family, even painful ones, can be an act of self-respect rather than betrayal. And perhaps most of all, it speaks to the quiet power of patience and documentation over confrontation, proof that real justice rarely comes from revenge, but from the courage to finally stand calmly and completely in your own truth.